All right, the New York Times is marking 1 year since George Floyd's death with a new series on the movement that was born out of Floyd's murder. The new series features essays on a number of issues, one arguing against qualified immunity, another explaining how grief can be channeled into justice and peace, and another asking if the movement will last. The topic we want to hone in on this morning is based on a focus group of 14 Trump voters who shared their thoughts about George Floyd. Here's what some of them had to say.
When I say George Floyd, Wanda, what word or phrase comes to mind?
That's a tragedy.
OD'd.
Painful.
Addict.
Murdered.
I listened to how you responded to Donald Trump and to the election fraud, and you were immediate. Like the response just came. There was no pause. I asked you about George Floyd. I know you all know who he is. I know you all know what happened, and yet you were very, very slow to give me just a word or phrase to describe him. Why were you pondering for so long?
With Trump, even though he was president, he's much less of a controversial figure than George Floyd was.
I'm a mother and a grandmother, and just the mention of his name recalls that video.
If I had a couple of sentences, it would have been a lot easier. I mean, who was he? Well, he was a drug addict who was a criminal who resisted arrest and put himself in a position where he was what happened to him happened.
Let's bring in the moderator of that focus group, longtime political strategist Frank Luntz, and deputy opinion editor at the New York Times, Patrick Healy, who sat in on the session. Fascinating answers.
Thank you guys so much for being with us. You know, I looked through this on Sunday, and there were answers that were shocking to me, and I think would be shocking to a lot of people. And yet, there actually, as you got to the end of it, Patrick, there seemed to be a spirit actually in some of the answers of people saying, we got to figure out how to get on the same page. We got to figure out how to be less divided over issues like this. Despite some of the reactions to your questions and your prompts, there were quite a few of these people who were saying, we've got to do better. Not them, all of us have got to do better, the media included.
Yeah, I think that's true, Joe, of some of them, not all of them, but some, you know, from the get-go were saying that they thought that George Floyd's death was a tragedy. Several of them said that. They were really grappling, it was clear, with what had happened over the last year in America. And I think at the end, when they were sort of asked that question, sort of what had changed in terms of race in America, you heard real discomfort with the divisions that they see on social media, that they see, and to some extent in their own lives. You know, one woman talked about talking to her husband about being unsure whether she and they wanted to have a baby and to bring a baby into the world right now. And you didn't have that kind of flame-throwing attacks that we got unfortunately used to with President Trump. That sort of constant sense that everybody was in their corners. You did get the sense, again, not from all, but from some of them, that they really were grappling with what kind of America they wanted to live in right now.
Well, and you also could see that there were some people that lived in a part of the country that seemed isolated from what many of us believe in, and the people that we talk to. I say that despite the fact, as I say all the time, I'm surrounded by Trump supporters, but that one clip we had where people said, well, George Floyd was a controversial figure, Donald Trump wasn't. So, Frank, I want to key in on a couple of answers that you got that I think will be stunning to most people that watch the show. 13 of 14 of the people you talked to believed that George Floyd was responsible for what happened to him. Were you surprised by that?
I was surprised by it, and it's really difficult. And I appreciate the New York Times and Patrick allowing us to do this. And the response from New York Times readers to this, I'm going to just add one bit of color to this. We're not used to hearing points of view that we don't agree with anymore. those who watch the different cable networks tend to agree with what they're watching because that's what they choose to watch. We now collect our news to affirm rather than inform. And I saw the comments of some of the people to this in the New York Times and some of the online comments as well. And there was a real anger among some people that Trump people were even allowed to express their point of view. And that's part of the problem right now. And I'm grateful for the Times for offering the space. And frankly, my condolences to Patrick for people who were so angry that the Times had done that. It shouldn't be that way. We should want to hear. We have every right to disagree. And what the Trump people said, I don't agree with. And there were a couple moments in that focus group that I got agitated with what they had to say. But they should be heard. If we're not going to create another Donald Trump situation, if we're going to find someone, and by the way, those are great kicks that you're showing. I would gladly pay for them and donate to any charity to get them. We need to know what we have to say. We need to know what they think, even if we violently, emotionally, morally disagree. We've got to hear, because in hearing, you can actually solve, you can actually heal. And yeah, surprise. But I think your viewers need to hear that stuff.
Yeah, there was another surprising one. 13 out of 14 people said that George Floyd's death did not change the way they thought about policing. And Patrick, talking about how of all the things that I saw in here, that some were surprising, some weren't surprising, I think the one there was an exchange between you and Evelyn that I thought was just fascinating, because it's what I hear all the time, where the media says that the protests were mostly peaceful. Every Trump person I talk to, when they look at last summer, they look at the riots, they remember the looting, they remember the chaos in the streets with Kyle Rittenhouse shooting people, they remember cities burning, they remember Minneapolis burning. And here's the back and forth. You say it's a fact that Black Lives Matter protests last summer in American cities were overwhelmingly peaceful. Do you disagree? And Evelyn said to you, I just want to say, is this a joke? I mean, are you serious? Really? They were peaceful protests? You've got to be kidding. Let me just say right now, if Evelyn doesn't speak for the 75 million people who voted for Donald Trump, she speaks for an overwhelmingly large percentage of it, because that's what I hear all the time. Patrick, talk about that exchange.
It was really interesting, Joe. Look, the reality is that that a lot of us live in different kind of bubbles, and a lot of these Trump voters live in a, Fox News, Newsmax, OAN bubble, and they talked about how news media, they just see all of the time sort of what bleeds, it leads, and they were particularly talking about the sort of scattered violence that we did see last summer. The reality is Fox News, others were playing this over and over and over again. They weren't showing the largely peaceful protests. They were showing the scattered acts of violence. And so what a lot of these voters were digesting, was what they were seeing on television, replayed night after night after night. And so when I asked that question, and I really tried to come at this in kind of a good faith way, we weren't doing gotchas, we weren't, pinning people saying, why do you say that? How dare you say that? There wasn't that kind of antagonism. We really were trying to have a back and forth. So I asked that question. There were some suggestions going on that these protests were so violent and that Black Lives Matter was a violent hate group, which it's not. And I made that point, and Evelyn, it was so clear that was one of the moments in the focus groups when she was living in a completely different reality than I was living in. That from her point of view, last summer was a very, very violent time in America, and that even though you had 26 million, as many as 26 million people marching in those first weeks after Floyd's murder, that really wasn't about 26 million people getting arrested or marching peacefully. They were marching peacefully, but it was about violence.
Yeah, Frank.
You know, Willie, really quickly, the thing is, two things can be true at one time. There were 26 million marchers. The overwhelming majority of those marchers were peaceful. There was looting, there was rioting. There were times where I saw in Los Angeles, I saw things on the street in Los Angeles that made me really angry while I was watching it last summer, too. But again, if you're watching a channel that does nothing but show these violent outbreaks on a loop instead of showing how 90% of the protests go, you are obviously going to think that there was nothing but violence last summer during the protests, and that's these two worlds that people live in.
Yeah, it's the filters that Patrick was talking about. We're seeing it, by the way, as we talk about this January 6th commission. You have Republicans saying, what about last summer? What about the riots of last summer? What about Antifa? What about Black Lives Matter? They want that to be part of a conversation which is completely separate and distinct from the one we should be having about January 6th. And Frank, it was interesting to hear you talking to this group just about the idea of having a conversation about race. I think one of the benefits of the last year for a lot of us, a lot of people in this country, is that we actually have broken down some walls and starting having honest conversations. And when you talked to some people in that group, they said, well, you know, let's talk about critical race theory being taught in our schools. But others said, you know, white people think we've come a lot farther than we have. And the opinion of this one person was black people don't think we've come as far as we actually have. So what was your sense just of having the conversation? Were they comfortable talking about race?
And it's one of the reasons why they were so quiet and so careful in responding about George Floyd. It's easy to come up with a point of view about Donald Trump. They're thinking that whatever they say may cancel them. Whatever they say may be used against them.